the interest. Today's guest is Oklahoma 1st District Congressman James R. Jones. The interview will be conducted by Ramona Hoffman.
Tulsa Congressman James R. Jones is a man who, according to some people, is politically in the right place at the right time. He's the chairman of the House Budget Committee at a time when there's talk of little else but the budget. Welcome, Congressman Jones.
Ramona, good to be with you again.
Thank you for joining us. Two recent statements you've made, Congressman, to start off our show. One, that the Reagan budget is made with mirrors and magic and that the 1982 proposed budget is unworkable. And then another more recent statement that there's a new national viewpoint by congressmen that will eliminate some of the partisan politics and pettiness and result in a boost to the budget. We talking about two different budgets?
Well, let me try to correct the first quote. I don't know if it was taken out of context or what, but in the speech that I made, I said that it is so important that we develop a budget of real spending cuts and fundamentally turn around this fiscal policy, the amount of spending that's going on at the federal level, that I am determined that we're going to build a realistic budget, and it's not going to be one based on mirrors or magic. That was the actual quote. I did not say that the Reagan budget was based on mirrors and magic, but I did criticize parts of their recommendations, which I thought overpromised and in such a way that there could not be delivery on the promise. And one specific was their assumption that interest rates in 1982 fiscal year budget would be 8.9%. And that's down from interest rates of about 16% or higher today. The economists who advise the Congressional Budget Office indicate that interest rates will be just a little above 11%. Now you may say, why do you quarrel over 2 percentage points difference in interest rates? And in terms of the federal budget, the amount of money, the amount of interest the federal government has to pay on the interest on the national debt is quite high. And if that 2 percentage points difference in interest rates, if they're off 2 points, that means $12 billion more in federal spending. And so that's why I've been insisting that the administration present a realistic, honest budget, and that Congress pass a realistic, honest budget. Now, with regard to the second part of your question, right. Here recently, we have been able to get the Democratic and Republican leadership of Congress to agree to the timetable that I set forth a month ago, and so we were able to take out of partisan bickering that amount of the debate over the new budget policy, and I think that's important.
You, as a Democrat, will be, I would think, expected to, in your position, lead any defenses against things that you see as inappropriate in the Reagan budget. You have been quoted, and again, we'll get the straight facts on this, but you've been quoted as saying that the budget will be reviewed and revised. What kind of revisions are we talking about?
Well, the one thing that I have insisted upon from the very beginning when I was elected chairman of the Budget Committee is that we take partisanship out of the budget process and for the first time try to get truly a bipartisan effort to make this Budget Act work and to cut spending. And therefore, as a Democrat, I'm not going to approach the budget on any kind of a partisan basis. Now, with regard to the budget itself, yes, I think the Constitution requires that Congress take a look at all administration programs and try to improve upon them. In the final analysis, the goal and the aggregate numbers of cuts that the Reagan administration is recommending, those will be achieved, but there's always more than one way to achieve them. And having had experience of 4 years in the White House myself, I recognize that no White House staff in any administration, Democrat or Republican, is so infallible that all it takes is Congress to rubber stamp whatever they say. And I think the people of this district, at least in their letters to me, have asked me to review that budget and to improve upon it if we possibly can, and that's what we hope to do.
Okay, you've had a chance to look over the budget proposals. Is there anything that strikes you right off as something that's got to go or got to be changed?
Well, we're exploring some questions that have come up. For example, on the cuts in Medicaid. there is some evidence coming to our attention that the effect of those cuts will be not to cut out the program, but to shift the tax burden from Medicaid, which is a broad base of taxes, to Medicare, which is a narrow payroll tax. And Medicare is funded to a large extent by the Social Security Trust Fund. If we put that kind of burden on the Social Security Trust Fund, there will be an enormous demand to increase payroll taxes again, or to decrease benefits for Social Security recipients. And so we're going to take a look at that program and see whether or not it makes sense, or whether or not there's a better way to cut the costs of Medicaid. There are other areas that we're looking at that I think deserve attention. For example, in the area of education, are we cutting education to such an extent that one of two things will happen? Either we will reduce the amount of educational opportunities, which is really the key that unlocks the future for all kinds of children of all backgrounds, or are we throwing a much heavier burden on local property taxes, which are already too high? These are the kinds of questions we're exploring. It's not a difference of opinion as to where we need to get in cutting spending, but a difference of opinion on how you get there.
Okay, now the other day you called into committee the inspectors general of the agencies in Washington, and you said, tell me about waste, fraud, corruption. Where is it? How much do we have? My question to you, where is it and how much do we have?
There is several billion dollars wasted at the federal level every year in every department, from the social agencies to the Department of Defense. But it doesn't do any good to say, let's just cut out waste, fraud, and abuse. You have to identify the specific agency and the specific way in which waste or fraud is occurring, and then you have to change the actual statutes in order to save the money. Let me give you an example. The Veterans Administration, we looked into that one agency and found out that approximately $420 million of uncollected debts, bad debts, have been written off, and these are loans from the Veterans Administration to various people across the country. About $50 million of that are bad debts owed by 66,000 federal employees. And you say, why don't you force the federal employees to pay it? Well, the law as it now exists does not give the government any kind of means to force federal employees to pay this debt. But one change in the law, which would allow garnishment of federal employees' salaries for failure to pay those debts, would enable us to collect $50 million in just debts owed the federal government from federal employees. And so that's the kind of thing that we're looking at, and our budget is going to recommend specific ways to save money and reduce waste. And I think that's an important element. We think that it will save about $3 to $5 billion next year.
Using that specific example, would a law passed now enable you to grandfather back to that for the time of the past debts and collect?
Well, you can't pass an ex post facto law, but assuming the debt is still owed and assuming the statute of limitations has not run, then the law that we pass today can make those debts immediately collectible, and they will have an impact immediately upon the law being changed. And so what we hope to do is include in the reconciliation bill, that's a long title, but what that means is one bill will contain all of the different spending cuts so that it's easier to pass, where you have an up or down vote on everything. But that one bill would change the law, and we'd attempt to pass that certainly by summer of this year. And then immediately the agencies could start collecting those due debts.
While we're talking about loans, on the day that the Loan Guarantee Board agreed to give Chrysler its $430 million that was requested, Budget Director David Stockman said, and if you need any more, there's $360 million more. Where that came from, all you have to do is ask. And on the very same day, out of Washington came a statement that said, okay, all you folks who have Small Business Administration loans, all you students who haven't paid your debts, all you farmers who haven't not paid back your small business loans. All you small businessmen who have not, be prepared, because Washington is getting prepared to take you to court and get that money back. That's a little distressing to people, not just because they're going to have to pay back money that they borrowed, but because the government appears to be on a trend toward doing what they can for big business and cracking down on the little people.
Well, I happen to agree with you. I voted against the Chrysler bailout program. I thought it was a mistake, and the taxpayers should not have been saddled with that particular program. But the fact of the matter is the majority of Congress voted to a $1.5 billion loan guarantee program, and so far $1.2 billion of that has been expended. So there is $300 million left for Chrysler if they choose to exercise that option. But I thought it was a mistake, and still believe it was a mistake.
Do you further think that there's no way that Chrysler can bail itself out at this point?
I think it's going to be very difficult for Chrysler to be a full service, a full competitor in the automobile industry. I think they would have been much better off to go through a reorganization plan and start targeting to a narrower market, and it wouldn't have cost the taxpayers the same amount of money.
Okay, we're going to take a break now, and we'll be right back to continue our conversation right after this. Welcome back to Conversation With. We're visiting with Tulsa Congressman James R. Jones, who is the director of the House Budget Committee, chairman of the House Budget Committee, pardon me. We, a moment ago before the break...
That's close enough for government work.
Right. A moment ago before the break, we were talking about the trend toward giving big business a break. And sometimes those of us who are not in such fortunate positions feel like it's possibly at our expense. Murray Wiedenbaum, chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, is a gentleman who has made a statement similar to the effect, never trust anyone who claims they're looking out for the public. I think that was directed primarily at Ralph Nader, but he also said something like, free the Fortune 500. Now, there has been some criticism that the Reagan administration is going to be so pro-big business that the consumer will suffer, and talk even that the Consumer Protection Agency will be cut back in funding and will be warned, don't make it so hard on big business. Your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's too early to tell on that yet. I think clearly the administration is going to recommend doing or lessening the amount of regulations that come out of all the agencies, and quite frankly, I think that is a trend in the right direction. In many respects, the agencies who over-regulate our society have the effect of actually adding cost to the consumer's price of a product. So I don't know that it's all that bad, and I think it's too soon to tell that the Reagan administration is going to actually favor big business over the other segments of the economy.
Congressman Jones, do you think that we've grown rather dependent upon things like Consumer Protection Agency, OSHA or OSHA as some pronounce it, those kind of agencies to protect us on the job, in the home?
Well, I think in the decade of the 1970s, we did become over-regulated. We did try to protect against all exigencies of any kind, and try to just think of everything that could happen and protect against it. And it's impossible to protect against all kinds of problems. I think there has to be minimum protection for the consumer, for the worker in the workplace, but as happens all too often in any institution, government, business, or labor, if they get too powerful, they extend beyond what the protection beyond what is needed. There is no reason, for example, in OSHA regulations to determine how far from the floor up the wall in a public bathroom the toilet paper dispenser has to be. And there was a regulation to that effect at one point before we wiped it off the books 2 or 3 years ago. And, in any event, you can over-regulate, and I think that was the position that the government got itself into in the late 70s, and we do need to pull back from that position and still not take away basic protections for the consumer and the worker.
Okay, some of the questions that we get every time we run a budget story here at Channel 6, and I'm sure some questions that you get over and over again are people concerned about the effects of budget cuts on the Social Security system. Can you tell us what you know about what the plans are and how and who will be affected?
Okay, the Reagan administration made three basic cuts in the Social Security program. One, they cut off the benefits, the college benefits to surviving children of survivors of Social Security recipients. The old law said that if you were over 18 and up to age 22, I think it was, as long as you stayed in school and college, you could get benefits from the Social Security Administration, you as a student. The Reagan administration proposes to cut that off. Second thing was what's known as the minimum benefit. It didn't matter how much you put into the Social Security system, so long as you worked the required number of quarters and paid something into the system, you could draw at time of retirement a minimum $122 a month. The Reagan administration proposes to cut that benefit off. The third benefit was the burial benefit at death. I think the Social Security law provided $250 burial payment at the time a Social Security recipient passed away, and the Reagan administration proposes to cut that. Other than those three changes, the administration doesn't change or cut back on the Social Security programs.
What about suggestions for mandatory pension plans through place of employment?
Okay, an outside independent blue ribbon commission studying the pension programs in America and the relationship they have to the Social Security programs recommended, among other things, that employers be required to set up a pension program in addition to Social Security, and that they be docked automatically a certain amount from the paycheck for that. That was a very controversial recommendation. There was a big split within the business community, a big split among organized labor, and a lot of split among the people. So I don't think that that's going to come to pass.
We don't have any choice about Social Security at this point, do we, as workers?
If you're, there are very few working categories that are not covered by Social Security. And yes, it's a mandatory program.
Okay. Yet we don't have that much control over what stays in and what stays out of the program.
Well,
as citizenry, do we?
Well, the Social Security program has been expanded. The benefits have been expanded considerably over the past 2 decades. And one of the problems with it is the revenues, the taxes to pay for those new benefits have not risen correspondingly in relation to the benefit increases. Right now, the benefits are automatically indexed, which means every year a Social Security recipient will get an automatic increase in those Social Security benefits based on the consumer price index. So, for example, in July of this year, Social Security benefits will go up about 12% over last year, and that's automatic.
Let's be realistic. By the time I am ready to retire, am I going to get anything out of Social Security?
Well, one of the things we need to change is the long-range look at Social Security. It is going to be so many centuries before you retire, Ramona.
Oh, yeah, right.
You're only 10 years old now. So, but by the time you retire, I hope that we will have made the right decisions in Congress and in the administration to make sure that that Social Security program is solvent. I think we will. But basically, we have to make some basic judgments at some point in time. And those judgments are, what do we want Social Security to be? If we want it to be all of the things that people are demanding of it now, which is an education program, a surviving spouse program, a retirement program, a disability program, a health program, we're going to have to pay a lot more money for it. Otherwise, we're going to have to scale the program back somewhat or increase the retirement age in order to pay for it. So those basic choices are going to face us in the next few years. And I just have to hope that both the administration and Congress will make the wise decision to make sure the fund will remain solvent.
Okay. Turning now to the effects on cities and states of the budget cuts, do you see anything really traumatic happening to Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Oklahoma in general as a result of cutbacks?
No, we're in a very envious position in Oklahoma. We're one of the few states that has so much of a surplus at the state level that we put all the other states to shame. In the city of Tulsa, we have a good high tax base, and we're able to meet the demands of local government much more easily in Tulsa than they are in, for example, Detroit, where they have such a high unemployment rate that their tax base is substantially reduced. Some of the cities and some of the localities will be hurt. And quite frankly, when you look at the overall budget, while we may have a parochial interest in Tulsa, we have to also look at how that budget affects all parts of the country, rural and urban. And that's one of the things we want to look at. I don't know what changes will be made, if any, but it's a very relevant question you ask. And as I say, we're just fortunate in Tulsa and Oklahoma that severe cutbacks in federal spending will not have that much of an effect on our own lives.
One of the great outcries is that cutting back on, in any way, on child nutrition programs, school lunch programs, that kind of thing, is absolutely the last place where budget cuts should go. First of all, what are your feelings about cuts in those areas? And then secondly, would you think it would be possible for the state of Oklahoma, being in the financial position that it is, to make up the difference?
Well, let me make two observations. First, there has to be a cutoff point beyond which the federal government should not be required to subsidize a program. For example, there's no reason why my children in my income category should be subsidized in their lunch by the federal government.
Could they be?
Yes, they could be.
Is that right?
Under the present law. That's the point. And I think we do need to cut back on that program. Having said that, however, I think we also have to make sure that those who need support for a nutrition program get that support. One of the things that we've learned in the past few years, that the success or failure of an adult starts way back in prenatal care and in early infant and childhood years. And if the proper nutrition isn't provided that child, the brain cells, the body cells don't develop in such a way that they can become an intelligent, productive citizen. So we have to be very careful when we shortchange the nutrition programs.
Okay, we're touching so many bases here, but something that comes to mind because it's been in the news recently, cutbacks to housing and urban development will affect Indian housing in Oklahoma, and state officials say it's going to set back the Indian communities 50 years if that happens.
Well, we haven't heard specifically from the Indian communities yet. I do have the Budget Committee staff looking into that proposal and see what kinds of real effects it will have. And so I can't predict at this time what the effect will be, but we're going to look at it.
You will not let that pass without looking?
Well, what we hope to do is to make sure that the sacrifice is shared equally by all segments of our society.
All right. We're going to take our final break, and we'll be back to wrap things up after this. Congressman James R. Jones, for the past 30 minutes, has been talking to us about his role as the chairman of the House Budget Committee and his feelings about the proposed Reagan budget. And in the last 30 seconds, we're going to give him a chance to make his predictions for that budget and what he expects to see happening on Capitol Hill in the next little bit.
Well, I am very excited because I think you're going to see this year a fundamental turnaround in federal spending policy. I think by midsummer, you're going to have a substantial amount of spending cuts, approximating $40 billion. You're going to have a tax program designed to reinvigorate investment in the private economy. And I think we have the opportunity of turning our economy around.